It is generally assumed that Marxists and other leftists have the political responsibility to support reforms for the improvement of the welfare of workers. Yet leading figures from the Marxist tradition, such as Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky, also understood that such reforms would broaden the crisis of capitalism and potentially intensify contradictions that could adversely impact the immediate conditions of the workers. So that's a paradox. For instance, full employment will be in a natural demand from the standpoint of all worker interests, also threatens the conditions of capitalist production, which rely on a surplus of available labor. Capitalism needs unemployment to continue to function and to motivate labor, thereby potentially jeopardizing the system of employment altogether. In light of such apparent paradoxes, this panel seeks to investigate the politics of work from leftist perspectives. It will attempt to provoke reflection on and discussion of the ambiguities and dilemmas of the politics of work by including speakers from divergent perspectives, some of whom seek after the immediate abolition of labor, and others of whom seek to increase the availability of employment opportunities. It is hoped that this conversation will deepen the understanding of the contemporary problems faced by the left in its struggles to construct a politics adequate to the self-emancipation of the working class. So starting from my left here, we have Mark Woodall. He's the UAW 2865 UC Merced Unit Chair, and also a physics graduate student at UC Merced. Further on to my left, we have Leo Niehorster-Cook, who's representing the Democratic Socialists of America on this panel. Leo is a graduate student in the Cognitive and Information Sciences Department here at Merced. Well, they employ the tools of computational social science to study distributed cognition and collective action. In the DSA, Leo specializes in electoral work and has been an organizer in several DSA chapters, including San Diego and UC Merced. Further on to the left, we have Adi Dasgupta, who's an assistant professor of political science here at Merced. And finally, on the far left, Jessica Sales, who's representing the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Jessica is from Tracy, California, and graduated from UC Santa Barbara in 2019 with a BA in sociology. Jessica is currently an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation in Central Valley. As far as the format goes, everyone will have up to 10 minutes to deliver their opening remarks. I will be timing the remarks and moderating the panel. I'll give you a notice when we reach the 1 minute mark. And then you will have 3 minutes to respond to the other panelists. After that point, we'll open up the discussion to Q&A. And we'll probably be going for about 2 hours. I believe Adi has to leave a little bit early, which is perfectly fine. Yes. So why don't we just start with Mark and work our way down. Please, Mark.
Thank you so much for having me. I confess that I don't have, I think, 10 minutes of fully prepared remarks, so perhaps we can simply have a lot of questions as we move along. But I think, first and foremost, it's interesting that we're discussing these diverging perspectives here on how labor and workers work. As I look around this room, even my representatives, several of them to my left, who are perhaps from differing perspectives on what workers actually need to do, have themselves been spending much of their time over the past month engaged in the same activities that we have in the labor movement here. Maybe what I would do is I would start by saying my perspective perhaps on how I came into labor organizing in the first place. So, like Daniel said in the introduction, I am a graduate student in physics here at UC Merced. I've been here now for 6 years, sort of maybe hopefully on my way out soon at some point. And I have been organizing on and off with UAW, the United Auto Workers, who represents all of the graduate workers and TAs and researchers here, to some extent the whole time that I've been here. I was participating early on when I got here. We were out of it for a little while because of the intricacies of which units were represented and not represented, and then came back in full force right around sort of the beginning of 2020. Some of the things that kind of motivated me to get back into that organizing at that point had been my realization, just sort of maybe souring on the mission of exactly what it was I was seeing in the university, exactly how perhaps its ideals were not being upheld, at least in their stated manner, and the realization that there was not a lot of recourse for members of the university to actually have a way to enforce fair working conditions, enforce their, obtain the fruits of their labor that they deserved. And that kind of led me back into participating much more heavily with the organizing campaign that kicked off in 2020 through 2021 to organize the student researchers. Perhaps to back up a little bit, the UAW 2865, which represents the TAs, the graders, the tutors, has been unionized and in existence since the late 90s. That itself was a product of a decade's worth of organizing prior to that. So the student researchers kind of closed a gap that was left in the late 90s by the failure of that particular unionization movement to really capture all of the aspects of graduate labor. It was a historic campaign to an extent, I would say. Obviously, in scale, there's nothing that's really been that we certainly haven't seen anything of that scale in the United States in the past decade, and in kind too. And I think that's something that maybe has been on my mind a lot lately, is exactly what the nature is of labor in the higher education context. Everyone here, I see many of my colleagues in here who are probably very familiar now at this point with the all-powerful distinction that the university and its agents like to throw at us, which is the distinction between a student and a worker. This is something that has been the subject of just endless litigation over the past few months and longer. And understanding exactly how different kinds of labor fit into each of these models. To put things bluntly, the expectation, I think, in higher education was that there was a certain class of workers, namely graduate workers who had completed some level of coursework, who were simply expected to continue doing labor for the university, for advisors, beyond whatever terms and conditions might apply to normal workers. This is one of the big things that I think this fight ultimately was about, was what exactly is a student worker? What exactly is labor in the context of higher education? When we were organizing this over the past year and a half and longer, it was challenging to conceptualize exactly what it means for higher education workers to labor, what it means to strike, and exactly how it does fit into the longer context of labor. Certainly wouldn't presume to speak on exactly the historical precedent that's going on here. There's a lot that goes into the history of this. But from my vantage point, it does seem that the fight that is currently playing out in this space, in labor and higher education, is one that I would expect to see play out in many aspects of labor across modern society. In post-industrial American life, we simply have fewer environments and fewer spaces where you have kind of this classic model of a factory organization, right? There's a bunch of people that work in a building. When they all leave the building and go on strike, the work stops, the pain is felt immediately, and it's a game of who can hold out longer in these sorts of actions. When the dock workers go on strike, these things tend to be resolved quickly because the pain is felt immediately. It's much harder we can see now, as we're entering a month of striking, that the same thing is not true in education, and certainly in the space of higher education. We can tell that it takes a great deal of time and of steady, slow burn for these kinds of actions to have the impact we desire. And that's simply the nature of the service that the university, for lack of a better word, that the university provides to its customers, to its students. I use those terms very specifically because that is how I view the direction that the university has taken in modern life. It's a business that's designed to deliver grades and credentialing to its primary customers, in this case, mostly undergraduate students. And in order to disrupt its operations, it requires a much longer and slower type of action than you might have traditionally associated with labor actions from past eras, or even in other industries that still exist today. This is something that we've had to navigate effectively for the first time because nothing like this has ever been done, certainly not at this scale. And, I'm not a scholar of these matters. It's not something that I have extensive history and background again. It is simply something that you at times find yourself in a position where you happen to be on the edge of, as many of you in here are, you simply happen to be on the edge of something that's happening that there is no prior description for, and you're making that history as you go. And this isn't to say that everything we've done along the way was correct or that we made the proper decisions along the way. It's simply to say we didn't know what we were maybe getting into several years ago when this started to be envisioned. And, I'm certainly curious to hear what colleagues up here have to say. I certainly see this as a model that extends to other aspects of employment in American life. We have some evidence of this before, teachers' union strikes come to mind. These are, types of working conditions that share a lot of similarities with what we do. We've even seen you can even make some correlations between aspects of the type of work that we do where I think most of us, maybe to some extent or another, enjoy what we do. I certainly did. I like physics. That's why I came here to do this, is because I want to do science. I enjoy this. And that enjoyment and that desire on our parts is exploited and used against us, right? That is one of the specific reasons that we are able to be charged. We are able to be compensated so poorly for this work and to be offered these, terrible conditions under employment is precisely because we're willing to put up with it, because this is something we want to do. We enjoy this work. We enjoy what we do here. I'm reminded of, I got a bunch of friends. I'm from Los Angeles originally. I have friends who are in a bunch of the various arts and trades and motion picture unions down there, a lot of IATSE people. And it's a similar kind of situation where these are desirable things. These are things people want to do. Corey, who doesn't want to work in the movies? Of course you want to work in the movies. But just because you want to work somewhere, just because it's something so desirable, does not mean that you as a worker have lost that dignity that comes with being a worker. And we struggle with this. This is, I would say, a core foundational piece of what we've had to do here in this kind of labor organizing. It's something that we're still uncovering and figuring out where this goes. Hopefully it will resolve in our favor.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. Let's move on to Leo.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. I wanted to talk a little bit in my opening statements, because I am here representing DSA, about what I view DSA's role in being in sort of rediscovering the world historical, thinking that the left has had historically, and maybe not so much today. But before I say that, I do want to say that I really want to emphasize that I don't think that what I'm about to say about DSA is unique to it. There are some people who say that DSA is going to be the next Bolsheviks or whatever, that we're going to be on top after the revolution. And that's very much not the picture that I'm trying to paint. So one of those biggest roles, obviously, and for those who don't know, the DSA is the Democratic Socialists of America. We've been in business since the 70s or something, but really took off after Bernie Sanders' 2016 election was a big part of that, or his candidacy rather. So one of the biggest roles that we have is spreading class consciousness beyond its kind of typical quarters, which are academia and the labor movement, right? You see a lot of Marxist academics and you see a lot of Marxists in the labor movement, but you don't see a lot of Marxists outside of that. Or just socialists more generally, and we would like to change that. So that means from every corner of the current sort of left liberal political hyperspace, you'll find DSA members. We are a big tent organization, so that means that we have we have a lot of members who are full-throated democratic socialists. You can think just like Bernie Sanders, right? That's their politic. We also have a lot of members who are anarchists, who are Marxist-Leninists. Every strain of socialism you can find in DSA, and actually probably have some non-socialists too. I wouldn't be surprised. And that also means that we have a lot of not just theoretical diversity, but also a lot of different diversity in terms of where you are in society. And so that means obviously like economic diversity. We have members who are in the upper echelons of the Democratic Party making 6 figures a year. We have members who are unemployed and actually homeless. And that also means sort of like professional diversity, right? So I know we also have a lot of members who are in the trades, and we have clearly a lot of academics and so forth. And so that's one of our biggest goals, is to kind of bring together left-wing politics in various groups and different understandings of left-wing politics, and try to put together one platform of action that socialists of all stripes can agree on, at least in the present moment. And one of our big roles also is the election of politicians to Congress or to other bodies, socialist politicians. We're not the only group that has elected socialists to Congress or to other boards, but I think in the United States, we're probably the one that has done the most. And that's not purely, that's not just a good thing, because it means that we also have to deal with the question of how do we keep these people accountable? And that's something that our organization is grappling with a lot right now. And another big push that DSA members have been engaged in is to integrate the core of socialism, which is sort of economic, right, with other left-wing developments, especially that have become popular in the past 50 years or so. I'm thinking primarily of things like intersectional feminism, decolonial thought, other sorts of left-wing developments and movements that maybe people who, when you first think of these movements, you don't immediately jump to socialism. And then finally, the last thing that we're really focused on is refining the organizational form. And I think about this all the time in UAW meetings, actually, because DSA, if there's one thing that they're serious about, even more than the socialism, it's the democracy. All of us are elected by the body. I mean, we do have staffers, but that's a very small proportion of DSA is staffers, and they're all like hired by a body that itself is overseen and elected, the National Political Committee. And that's something that we're experimenting with all the time, because DSA chapters have the ability to make a change to their own internal organization. So every time I move to a new chapter, I have to figure out, like, do we call it the steering committee here or the central council or what? And there are different roles that go with different names. And that's something that I think has been very helpful and beneficial to us. We can see that some forms of organization simply don't work or are really well adapted to a specific kind of political environment, but maybe not others. So that's one of the things that I think is actually the most important. I would say the most important thing that DSA does generally is refine the organizational form. And I think we also push off a lot of those ideas onto other groups. I can't tell you how many times, like I said, I've been in one of these UAW meetings and I'm like, why do you guys not just do it this way? Or couldn't we vote on this? But there are bylaws, and the bylaws are non-democratic. Democracy, or I'll just say voting, is only one form of problem solving, of collective problem solving. And I'm not going to argue that it's a privileged one or that it is the best one in all circumstances, but it's one that I think works really well. And especially given where we are right now in human history. And given where we are right now in human history, I also think it's really important to note that the collaboration between socialists and graduate student unions is one of the few places here in the imperial core where we can really mix white collar and blue collar workers, or what might typically be called white collar and blue collar workers, and have people coalesce around shared class interests. Because it's clear to all of the workers on strike, like, we get shitty pay, we get treated horribly, and there's a very real sense in which we are working class. But at the same time, I think a lot of people in graduate school come into it with this impression that they're a professionalized, upper class member of the bourgeoisie, and that the laws of labor don't apply to them, so to speak. So I think it's really great that we have socialists meeting with people in graduate student unions and kind of spreading that ideology. And then finally, since we're speaking today about some of the contradictions concerning like the contemporary problems and how we can have a self-emancipation of the working class, I wanted to note one, I don't know if it would be a contradiction exactly, but one thing that I've seen called for actually regarding our own picket line and in other contexts too, that I was really reminded of when reading the prompt, which is how many academics, I've seen this, many academics have actually called for a reduction in the number of funded PhD programs so that they can make more money themselves, so that we can get paid, let's have fewer of us. And I think that's really reminiscent of this problem of the abolition of labor versus full employment and similar problems like that. With that, I will yield my time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Leo. And moving on to Adi.
Yes, so glad to be here. I'm Adi Dasgupta. I'm an assistant professor of political science. My office is just down the hallway. And so I haven't been very involved in labor organizing myself, but some of the topics I study include political economy, and especially the relationship between technology, technological change, capitalism, and democracy. So these are big topics. I'm just going to share some like big picture thoughts about the history of technological change and its relationship to labor and democracy. I like to work with slides, so I just put up a few slides here. They're mainly going to be pictures. And as the prior panelists were talking about, labor organizing in the university, in the knowledge economy, new forms of organization. I think all of those ideas might come in here to varying extents. So the theme of the panel today is the politics of work. And so immediately I started thinking about, well, what is work, right? And I just went to the Oxford English Dictionary, and there are about like dozens of different definitions, right? It can be as fundamental as to act, do, function, operate, almost to exist, right? It can correspond to labor, to do a job, to be employed, for instance, a specified job or number of jobs, right? To work can also apply to machines, which is interesting, right? It can describe the function, running, operation of a machine effectively or in a specified manner, right? So work can be performed by people, it can be performed by technology, it can be performed by a combination of those two things. Okay. So that got me thinking about, well, what is the relationship between technology and work in history? And I was thinking about these two very different ideas or positions that exist out there in scholarship, right? One view is the classic view of Karl Marx and Engels, right, in the Communist Manifesto, which views technological progress as fundamentally like immiserizing, right? As technology is improved, it automates functions previously performed by humans, and it worsens the conditions of workers until it precipitates a communist revolution, right, when conditions get that bad. Yeah, that's a grim view of technological change in work. Another view that comes from maybe neoclassical economics, right, is precisely the opposite. That view is that technological change is the lever of riches, right, in the words of Joel Mokyr, who's a famous economic historian. And in this view, technology is what makes us prosperous, and it's kind of like a rising tide that lifts all boats. Okay. And so I was thinking about this when we think about the history of technology and work, which of these two perspectives is true? If we go back to the Industrial Revolution, right, we can think of like two different kinds of images. We can think on the left of the Luddites, right? These were the textile workers who started destroying the machines, which were like automating what the work they had previously done manually, right? Or we can think of these thriving factories, which gave rise to kind of like factories and boom towns like Detroit, provided mass employment to a kind of prospering working class, right? In places like, well, in various places. This isn't something, right? These two conflicting images is not something that just comes from the Industrial Revolution. It's part of our modern day, like post-industrial knowledge economy, right? If we think about the knowledge economy, we could think about, like Apple headquarters, right? iPhones, like all the prosperity that comes from that, right? We can also think about all the people who have been left out, right, of the modern knowledge economy. And, the increasing forms of like social conflict that engenders. Yeah. So is technological progress something that makes people worse off, like puts them out of work, or is it something that complements work, makes us better off? And I think what economic historians have found is that it depends on the context, right? And it depends on the time period. So this is some data which basically shows you in blue data on historical GDP per worker, okay, in England around the Industrial Revolution. So this is a measure of basically how productive the economy is as a whole. Yeah. Through the Industrial Revolution, this is increasing, right? As technology is progressing, you're having an Industrial Revolution, right? How did that correspond to the actual living conditions of workers? Well, historical data on the real wages of workers, right, shows an early period where workers' wages basically stagnated. This was famously called Engels' pause, right? So inequality was rising, more and more wealth is being generated. It's being captured, right, by capitalists, by factory owners. Not much of it is going to workers. Okay? But that started to change towards the second half of the Industrial Revolution, when real wages of workers actually started to rise again. Okay? So we can't just say that the Industrial Revolution was good or bad for workers, right? It depended on the time period. Same thing is true when we look at the 20th century, right? A period of huge technological progress. This is data from the United States. What this time series shows you is data on the labor's share of income, right, in the United States, right? So of like GDP that is generated, what share of that takes the form of salaries, wages, payments to workers, right? You look at the early 20th century, right? There's a period of a huge rise in labor's share of kind of like national prosperity, right? Followed by a large scale decline, especially beginning in the 1970s, okay? So we can even break that down further, right? So if we're looking from the 1970s and 1980s onward, right? The share of kind of like national wealth that is accruing to labor is shrinking, right? And even among workers, right, there's growing inequality. So if you look at family incomes, right, over time between 1950 and the present period, right? There was between 1950 and 1970 a period of sort of shared gains across different percentiles of the income distribution. But since the 1980s, there's been a fanning out, right? For households who are in the median or lower percentiles, there has been basically since the 1980s, no increase in real incomes. All of the incomes that have increased have been concentrated in the top percentiles. Yeah. And so the puzzle that I think this poses, right, is I think there's not some uniform relationship between technology and work, right? And I think what really shapes whether technological progress is something that benefits people broadly, or whether that's something that's captured by a narrow segment of the population, is institutions. And one particular form of institution, right, is labor unions. And so what I would argue is that one reason labor unions are so important, right, is that they shape how broadly the surplus generated by technological change is distributed in society. So this is just to show you labor union membership in the United States over time. In the blue line, you can see over the course of the 20th century, there was this big increase followed by a decline. In yellow is the share of income accruing, I think, to the top 10% of the population. you can see this very close correspondence between inequality and the degree of unionization in the United States. So what is it that labor unions have done historically, right, that have helped to distribute the wealth that is generated by technological change broadly? Well, historically, labor unions played a key role in the emergence of democracy. So if you think about well-known kind of labor movements like the Chartists, organization of the working classes in 19th century England, they played a key role in forcing the British kind of political elite to extend the right to work to workers. What else did labor unions do? They played a key role in the emergence of the modern welfare state as we know it, right? Once democracy was extended to working class people through labor-based parties. Yep, they played a key role in the expansion of the welfare state. And I think that brings us to the modern period, right? We're now in the knowledge economy. We no longer have the kind of docks and factories as the major source of employment. We have universities, other forms of organization, right? And I think the key challenge going forward is that in this knowledge economy, like how do we reinvent labor organizing in a way that distributes the gains from technological change from universities in a way that's shared widely? Yeah, so those are my thoughts.
Okay. Thank you, Eddie. And moving on to Jessica.
All right, so similar to Audie, because the panel is called Politics of Work, we also thought it would be best to define what is work. So I have work is a transaction between worker and capitalists. Workers sell their labor power to capitalists, which are people who own the means of production, like factories, farms, steel plants, etc., for a wage. And generally, wages are enough to sustain workers so that they're able to reproduce that labor day after day. And we have a quote from Marx that summarizes it a bit more succinctly. The exercise of labor is the worker's own life activity, the manifestation of his own life. And this life activity he sells to another person in order to secure the necessary means of subsistence. Thus, his life activity is for him only a means to enable him to exist. He works in order to live. He does not even reckon labor as part of his life. It is rather a sacrifice of his life. It is a commodity which he has made over to another. And so based on this transaction, we can see that two classes in society arise. We have those who work and those who own, leading to irreconcilable contradictions. So it's always in the interest of the capitalists to keep wages low, and to have what Marx would term a reserve army of labor, which is a large subsection of people who are unemployed or underemployed, that are desperate for work, who the capitalists can use as leverage to replace those workers that go out of line and to unionize for better wages, and things like that. And on the other hand, we have the working class who wants the highest wages possible and a secure and guaranteed job, otherwise known as full employment for all. And capitalists set their capital in motion in hopes of increasing its value. And for that, they rely on our ability to work because only our labor power can create wealth. So each dollar that goes to the worker is a dollar that's lost in profits. And the only solution to this is a revolution where the whole capitalist system is destroyed and worker power put into place, or the so-called seizing the means of production. And our perspective is that workers make the world run, so workers should run the world. The capitalist class is a parasitic class that has outlived its purpose. The only work of the CEOs and corporate boards is to find ways to make workers work longer hours for less pay, to drive down benefits, lobby against legal safeguards for workers, to carry out union busting. And this is not productive work. It is not work that benefits society, but rather work that siphons the wealth of society into their own pockets. But currently we still live under capitalism, and though we're building a movement towards revolution, this is where reforms come in. Reforms create better working conditions and make living under capitalism a little bit less harsh and marginally better. And one such vehicle of reform is the union. So unions play an important role under capitalism. Organized workers are a major force against capitalist employers, and they are necessary for the workers' struggle against capitalism more broadly. Without union resistance, fighting for and winning higher wages and better working conditions, employers could push wages lower and lower to increase their own profits. So unions are beneficial in bringing workers together, realizing their power, and also revealing contradictions that may not have been obvious before. Lenin wrote, quote, "Reforms cannot be either enduring or far-reaching," end quote. And with this, he made it clear that true emancipation of the workers is not possible by trying to fix capitalism or change its inherently exploitative nature. It's important to maintain that unions and reforms alone are not the end goal. Lenin argued that the abolishment of wage labor and thus the abolishment of capitalism requires a revolutionary working class party that can win over the confidence of the working class and lead it away from the politics of compromise of the dominant capitalist parties. In the absence of a revolutionary party, the bourgeoisie happily steps in and pushes workers into the safe channels of bourgeois democracy, such as our two-party electoral system. But Lenin also said that it is not sufficient for the Revolutionary Party to hold a correct political line. He added that the working class must learn from their own experience, and this is also where reforms come in. The struggle for reforms is a critical element in building class consciousness among workers because it is through that struggle that class lines are drawn, and workers can see which side of the barricades the politicians stand on, which sides the cops stand on which side the Supreme Court stands as well. And those of us with a revolutionary outlook can repeat over and over that the Democratic Party is not on the side of the workers, but that is no substitute for the real life experience of watching the Democrats smash the strike of rail workers who are asking for a few days of sick pay. It is the duty of revolutionaries to fight side by side with workers for each and every reform that lifts up the conditions of working people, while at the same time exposing the bankruptcy of the capitalist system and its political operatives. So overall, we see that reforms improve workers' immediate conditions and develop workers' consciousness to see that they have the power and that they produce all the value and don't really need bosses. However, there are limits to reform that we can see by analyzing the labor movement, including struggles that are happening today. In recent news, two of the most pressing labor struggles are the ongoing UAW strike that we see happening on campus, and also the national rail workers' fight for a fair contract. By looking at these examples of economic struggle, we can learn a couple of things. The first being that the workers' struggle exposes the contradictions of capitalism. Workers' demands for sick leave and a living wage demonstrate that these tenets of dignified, fair work are not guarantees of capitalism, but are won by organized workers through struggle and bargain. And because the working and owning classes have diametrically opposed interests, we see workers have to ultimately make some concessions to appease employers, going back and forth on contracts until both sides are satisfied. And even more indicative of the precariousness of reformism, in the case of the National Rail Union struggle, we see the state also intervening to protect the interests of owners rather than the workers, denying workers the valuable tool of striking and trying to force contracts upon them. And this act is representative of the role of the capitalist state in the class struggle, criminalizing workers and using force to put them back into line for the owning class. The second thing we can see is that the struggle for workers' rights and union protections under capitalism is never ending. Rights are given and rolled back at the discretion of the ruling class. Railroad workers were on strike in the 1870s, in the 30s and 40s. They were on strike in 92, and they're threatening to go on strike today, demonstrating how labor struggle alone posed as the means and the end is simply not enough. It only temporarily alleviates the hardships inherent under capitalism. And attempting to reform the system will not lead to the emancipation of the working class. Therefore, the true aim of progressives needs to be a mass movement towards revolution. So this leads us to think, how can we think beyond the reform struggle, even beyond the union struggle? And recognizing the limits of reform is by no means an acceptance of defeat or an excuse for hopelessness. Knowing that reform doesn't go far enough should motivate us to uphold the goal of revolution in all our actions, because we know that that is the only way to end the system which forces workers to have to sell their labor power. Though politically educating folks involved in economic struggle is valuable, it is not the sole method of organizing, nor is it the sole battleground of revolutionary method. There are a great number of people already involved in political struggles like anti-imperialists, police and prison abolitionists, student opposition groups, and others who are involved in these struggles without realizing that their struggles are all connected and rooted in capitalism. So the role of true revolutionaries is to work in concert through the vehicle of a party to further the political education of all of these groups, to guide and support their leaders and instill in them the belief in revolution, because only together can we dismantle the entire political and economic structure and truly see the self-emancipation of the working class.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jessica. So now we'll have 3 minutes for each panelist to respond. Let me see if I can thread together some of the comments here that you might consider taking up. So Mark talked about the post-industrialization knowledge economy and what that might mean for the traditional, I guess, structure of labor unions, a problem that has to be adapted to for the worker to obtain the fruits of labor. And you also mentioned the dignity of labor. Let's see. So Leo talked about this sort of question of economic socialism, integrating different social movements under a big tent organization, which has one platform of action, in which there's a refining of organizational reform through a democratic foundation. So I guess my question for you there is, how does that connect up with the sort of the world historical role that you also mentioned is one function of the DSA to somehow preserve the memory of the left? For Addie took up this question of the knowledge economy and I guess or post-industrialization defined as the knowledge economy set out sort of two ideas or pathways towards looking at work, either as leading to unemployment, which Addie characterized as the view of the Communist Manifesto, I believe. And then also this other alternative of work being the lever of riches. And he mentioned that the relationship between wages and technology seems to actually shift and change depending on the period in question. So I was wondering, Adi, if you could maybe speak to why this earlier sort of industrial period, which we might call Fordism, was transformed into the knowledge economy, but some people call post-Fordism, or I guess we could also just call it neoliberalism, and what might be the political reasons for that transformation. And one other question there, you've addressed distribution, but what about this question of production and how might production itself be transformed? And then for Jessica, this gets back to this question of the fruits of labor or the dignity of labor that Mark was raising. So Marx critiqued this idea of the just fruits of labor in the Critique of the Gotha Program, which is one essay that we read in the Platypus reading group. And Marx critiqued this concept with the idea of labor power, which you also raised, Jessica. So my understanding there is that the concept of labor power is that labor has become like rationalized, right? It's not just labor, it's not just us working with instruments, but rather this notion of labor power presupposes like a quantity of labor applied to machinery. So what does it mean? What does this notion of labor power mean to older notions of like political economy, which might have changed or transformed under capitalism? And then one final question, you talked about, on the one hand, the need for a mass movement to kind of connect different radical activism, somewhat in the manner that Leo was mentioning, but also you mentioned the need for a political party for socialism. So how do you reconcile the idea of a social movement with this notion of a political party for socialism? Okay, so maybe we could go in the same order.
I apologize for the memory of a goldfish here. What was your main takeaway, the thing you were looking for me to respond to?
Yeah, so do you see any limitations to this formula, the just fruits of labor or the dignity of labor, that I think are kind of time-worn notions that the labor movement often raises, but that have been critiqued from the Marxist tradition for being insufficient?
Yeah. I mean, you know, the answer you'll get from me is always a pragmatic answer, because the nature of labor organizing is that the tent that you're trying to put together, the coalition that you're trying to assemble, has wildly divergent views on a lot of these things. And to some extent, my answer is labor is dignified for those who want to have, like searching for dignified labor means something to those who want to have dignified labor. Some people don't want to see themselves as having labor at all. One type of organizing we have to deal with frequently is folks who just refuse to acknowledge that what they're doing is itself labor. To some extent, they're mistaken. I believe they are mistaken. I believe the evidence shows they are mistaken, and that an objective view of this would say that. And yet they continue to think this. It's difficult to pull people away from that idea. It's a powerful motivator in this knowledge economy where a lot of these jobs are highly desirable and get to work on things that approach self-fulfilling in some way. I make this joke a lot that workers in these kinds of industries, in other kinds of dying industries like print media and these places, it's highly valuable for them to unionize because they need to protect what little they have left. The joke, of course, is that, the people who need to unionize the most, in my view, beyond anyone else, because of the untold riches they could unlock, are Facebook and Google's engineers. These are people who are paid more likely than you, me, or anyone else in here ever will be. They are comfortable beyond worldly concerns. And yet the sheer value of what they produce, much in line with what we've talked about earlier, and how this wealth is distributed, there's so much that Google's engineers could have the potential to unlock by unionizing that it boggles the mind. This is true in many industries like this. And so, dignity of labor, I think, means different things to different people. And I don't know that I have a fully fleshed out view beyond that, but it certainly is a perspective that differs depending on who you're talking.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Leo?
Yeah. So you asked about the connection between the world historical content and the organizational form, the refining of the organizational form. So I think this is one problem that socialists historically have dealt with in a number of ways. That whenever it seems like a bunch of socialists get together, they stop doing that shortly. Whether it's the Internationale, or whether it's here in America, we had organizations like Students for a Democratic Society, even the Wobblies, the International Workers of the World, they still exist, but they're not nearly the power they once were. And I think that is one of the major struggles that DSA deals with over time is, we have a high turnover rate, like most social movement organizations, people come and go. And that really creates a difficulty in linking the form of the organization with anything in the long term, even over the course of one person's life, let alone world history. But I think this is something that really boggled the Soviets and sort of just like the Eastern power, the power bloc that came out of that more generally. To this day, I think you still find this in both internally and in Westerners debating, like Cuba and China and countries with strong socialist states that are doing things for working class people, but are often criticized as authoritarian. And I think another thing that this highlights is the role of socialists in relation to extant states, and how, what sorts of engagement with states can possibly lead to a diminishment of their power. Because the classic line from Marx, as you pointed out, is eventually things get bad enough that we're going to have a revolution. And then at that point, we will have our own state, we'll implement or maybe take over the existing one, but violently, right? We will impose the will of the proletariat on the state, and therefore the capitalist class will be abolished, right? Whereas for anarchists, often it's the shoe is on the other foot, that private property can only abolish once the state has already been abolished, right? The private property is a legal fiction and therefore can be abolished in one fell swoop with the state. Now, it seems clear that at present, for the record, I'm an anarchist. seems clear to me at present that it is unlikely that anytime soon we will either abolish or like destroy the state militarily. And that's why I'm a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, because I'm not a full-throated democratic socialist, right? I just said I believe in the abolition of the state, including all democratic parliamentary structures and no constitution or anything like that. But it seems to me that at present, all that really we're able to do in terms of getting us back into this world historical mindset is to engage in mass organizations with socialists of all different stripes and even non-socialist, just left-wing thinkers, and try to come to some sort of consensus about where we are in history and what kind of organizational form we need to match that.
Okay, thanks, Leo. Adi?
Yeah, so the way I understood your question is kind of, what's been driving the changes in the economy in the kind of late 20th century, from the factories to the quote unquote knowledge economy. And I think the two major things that have happened are globalization and something called skill biased technical change. So globalization basically offshored or outsourced a lot of manufacturing work to lower wage places like China. Skill biased technological change created new forms of work that basically complemented skills that you get in higher education. So something that's been happening over the course of the late 20th century is the college wage premium has been going way up. So the gap between wages for those with a college degree versus those without, that gap has been growing. So this change has produced huge amounts of wealth, right? These transformations. It's also created winners and losers. So when you have a functioning social contract, what's supposed to happen, right, is that the winners compensate, right, the losers to some degree through a functioning welfare state, through redistribution, through other mechanisms, and that really hasn't happened. And I guess I would just give two examples of this. One are universities, right? So in a context where the college wage premium has been rising, right? How would you facilitate greater equality? Well, you'd want to give people easier access to college, right? But this has been the same time period where tuitions have been going through the roof, right? Getting access to a good university education has not necessarily been easy. You could think about new forms of work, right? Like the gig economy, right? You could think about like Uber. Uber generated tons and tons of wealth for its shareholders, right? Or its, but on the basis of a bunch of very poorly paid people who work for Uber, right? With minimal benefits, minimum wages, and so forth. So I found this conversation really interesting because I think all of the three other panelists have been thinking about how can labor organizing be reinvented for like the current age? And I think that's a really interesting question to kind of how do we change the direction we've been headed in?
Jessica?
Yeah, I just don't remember your first question, but the second one is about sort of reconciling a party and social movements along those lines. So basically, I don't think there's much of a reconciliation to be done. I think that, well, social movements, all the different struggles that I sort of talked about, the role of the party in this period, especially pre-revolution, is to politically educate everyone in all of these struggles so that we're kind of on the same page. Like there, for example, with the Black Lives Matter movement, it was a case of police brutality. It led to a lot of people becoming interested in prison abolition, police abolition, but maybe they just weren't, or didn't make the connection, like the police and the prisons, these are state apparatuses that are used by the ruling class to suppress the working class. Like this is also a function of capitalism. It's what keeps everyone in line. So just kind of, so using that example, like just spreading that awareness, not even awareness, but the knowledge is like making the connections, like, this seems like a separate issue, capitalism and the workers' struggle and, prison abolition, but in reality, they're connected. So I think that's the role of the Revolutionary Party, because also the party, we're not like, it's not like the Democrats and the Republicans, are not trying to run for office and win presidency. And like through reformism, that's not really what the goal is. Or a revolutionary party, the goal is revolution. And I think that you need as many people and as many struggles as you can on board with you on the same page, so that you can all work together towards revolution and ultimately dissolving of classes and of the state.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. So now let's open floor to questions. Sebastian, if you could periodically monitor that and see if there's a question coming in. We'll get to it eventually, but let's go to people in the room first. Do you want to come?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I actually have a question for Adi.
Mhm.
Adi? Yeah, so I thought it was interesting, your presentation. Thank you for that, by the way. I think that when Marx talked about also like technology causing the administration of like, the working class, I think he meant that because technological advances at that time were in the hands of the ruling class, right? So I think in the hands of the ruling class, technology really is eviscerating. And actually, we can see that in contemporary America, where you see graphs of like, as production go up, wages go down, right? Which doesn't really make sense. If production goes up, we're creating more value. Our wages should also be increasing, but it doesn't work that way because of the capitalist class. And then also one of the graphs that you had, I think, that showed the wages and then technology, I think stopped at 1910, which I think if that graph would have kept going past 1917, which was the Russian Revolution, where you would actually be able to see that as people took state power, right, the seizing the means of production, like Jessica said, that the technology is now being wielded by the people and for, their productivity and like bettering of their society. So wondering if you have any thoughts on that too.
Yeah, those are great questions. I mean, I think I agree with, everything you hinted at. I think there's this whole debate about appropriate technology, right? And I agree. I think technology can be designed in different ways. It can be manipulated by different classes, different individuals, and that's going to have distributional consequences. So I think I agree.
Alex.
A question for Jessica. As recently, literacy rates in the U.S. for adults, 50% are below the sixth grade level. Going on that past like a post like with the advent of social media, how do we bring about more consciousness to the working class? And more modern sense, is there a need for a vanguard party like Lenin's concept?
Okay. So in terms of politically educating the working class, I didn't know that statistic about the literacy in the US. That's really interesting, actually. But I think sort of like what I hinted at earlier, I mean, political education isn't necessarily like forcing everyone to read these things. I think that also comes from the struggle, the economic union struggle, workers struggle in general, just seeing the contradictions, seeing things that happen in your workplace, and then having discussions with other people, whether it's your coworkers or people in a completely different industry, or you happen upon people in a revolutionary party or some people who have like more radical ideas. That is kind of what expands people's political consciousness, and eventually these things like raise people's awareness. Obviously, I would hope like after revolution, then we could obviously like help these things like in Cuba, fixing the literacy rates and things like that. But obviously we can't do that under these circumstances. But I think that those are other ways that we can definitely like aim to help people expand their political consciousness. And in terms of the Revolutionary Party, I mean, yeah, I do think that is necessary kind of for the reasons that I said. I think without people who are disciplined and organized and kind of who have this ability or this sight, like if you have a revolutionary outlook, you can see, or you think in a Marxist dialectical method, like see the way that all these struggles are connected, and then through the party, coming into contact with leaders from other struggles and then helping them to make those same connections. I think that's one of the really important benefits of having a party, just for like leadership aspect and building other leaders. It's not like, oh, we all lead everyone else. You want as many leaders as possible, and you want the leaders to be from the masses. And so I think that's really important.
I think that was just aimed to Jessica, but did anyone else want to respond?
Oh, yeah, it's 30 seconds on that. That's okay.
It's up to you.
Yeah, sure. I actually agree that we need a vanguard party, but even more so, I think we need like 30 of them. Like, I don't think personally that we're ever going to get to the position where we have like one privileged organization that pushes us across the finish line to revolution. We're going to need a huge coalition, multi-tendency coalition, of a bunch of different groups. That's my thought.
Okay, they're in the back.
I think for a long time there was blind trust put into higher like leaders, and maybe taking advice for the longest time about direction, and maybe having a very set goal of trying to accomplish set whatever was point, but avenues or like responsibilities that social workers might hold. They definitely change perspective and definitely allows the worker to question way more and move away from the blind trust and the idea that maybe the leaders have what's always best interest for the workers.
Okay, so the question about the problems of leadership and workers, I suppose, Mark, we were talking about that before the panel started, and perhaps others could respond as well. This problem of workers and leadership.
Yeah, no, I the whole time you were talking, this is stuff that we have to deal with frequently in labor organizing. I think, as always, like, my perspective in this is it comes from the actual implementation of these real organizations and these ideas, right? And in their actual implementation, what you frequently discover is that there is a certain cast of leadership. There's labor nobility. This is a common idea and a common concept. A group of people whose job it is to be who sort of professionalize the running of, the organizations that are sort of there to protect workers themselves. And this can be folks, to some extent, this can be folks like me who are, in taking on a position, to some extent, managing the interests of workers and trying to channel their needs, and their concerns. It can go much further than that, though. And it tends to be the case that the higher up you go in organized labor, the more often you find folks who are just increasingly disconnected from the actual work of workers themselves. In many cases, their working conditions are completely dissimilar to the people that they're supposed to be representing. And this can create a lot of problems and a lot of distrust. The exact distrust you're describing is playing out in full force, I would say, right now. Across the UAW, because this is an organization that is one of these old, this is one of these old school unions. There's plenty of this internal politics and hierarchy and leadership disputes about what workers do and do not want, what is and isn't in their best interest. So this is certainly something that is alive and well, and even organizations who are out to and who are out to serve the interests of workers fight with these same hierarchies all the time, and it's a constant struggle to figure out what to do about it.
Did anyone else get a response? If not, we can open up the floor for another question.
Thank you for that. That was a great response. So this is just a bit of devil's advocacy here, so don't shoot me. But specifically, and this is for anybody, but specifically speaking to the point of like the revolution and the dissolution of the state, what I would like to know, though, is regardless of how this comes about, like there's a very important answer of what do you put in place after the revolution? What is the proposition of like a better form of the state, or is there some kind of assumption that, it's not necessary, that chaos or anarchy is preferable to the status quo. And this goes a little bit back to what you were just saying, is like, there is the danger of becoming the thing that you're fighting against. How would any of you propose to answer that?
Yeah, can I take a crack? So when you think about capitalism as like the general setup whereby one person sells their labor, which is what you described at the beginning, right? When one person like receives a monetary amount for the time and labor that they put in. And then you talk about like abolishing that and what comes after. So first of all, I think it would be really difficult to abolish capitalism and then make a worse system. Like that would be tough. I don't know how one would do that. But
He's seen it happen in history. I'm just putting that out there.
yeah, and
You could have feudalism. for
that's
example.
fair. We could go
We came
back.
from.
Yeah. But I think that even scary commie dictatorship would still be like on a world historical level, still less exploitative than world capitalism. In particular, because one of the big things is it doesn't encourage slavery, which is still a problem that we have, especially in places where capital rules the political system. But to answer your question more positively, I think that it makes sense to some degree, to look back, not to feudalism,
Yeah.
but
Seems bad.
throughout most of society, throughout most of human history, societies have had neither law enforcement nor bullion money, right? All of the economy throughout most of human history has been done through either decentralized currencies, meaning I'm a shopkeeper and I make my own wooden tokens so that I can give them to people for stuff, and then later they give me the tokens back and I give them stuff out of my shop, or actually just through credit, right? Most of human history has been a credit economy. And we're going back that way, actually, right? We're starting to eliminate bullion and actually even the paper money from our economy and starting to move entirely to plastic. And so I think if you could think about an economy that was structured like that, meaning the original sort of agrarian economies, where trade relations are done without any sort of centralizing, or even the currency itself is not backed by the fact that you can pay taxes in this to the monopoly on force. It's backed by the fact, if we use currencies at all, it's backed by the fact that there is somebody creating them and giving them to people in exchange for things and taking them back. So that's a form of economic backing. Now there's also this question I think you were alluding to this also, there's a self-defense angle to it, right? Because it's hard to abolish capitalism all over the world at once, right? So to some degree, many people will say, how do you defend yourself from the re-entrance of capitalism? And I just wanted to sort of give that distinction or create that distinction, right? How do you maintain a system on the inside from maybe devolving back into capitalism or going back into some other even more hierarchical form of social relations? And then also the question of invasion. And that second question, I'm not even going to attempt to answer.
Yeah, thank you. But more specifically, to narrow that down, I'm not necessarily against what you're saying, but I don't think that the current world order or population, just sheer population, is at this time capable of reverting to this kind of agrarian decentralized system. It's untenable unless zombie apocalypse, then yes, we can do this. But short of that, forgive my glibness, I don't see that like as an actual real solution. Like, there's gonna be a power vacuum. Somebody's gonna step into the power vacuum. And hopefully we can say it's somebody that's beneficent, but there's no guarantee.
Did anyone else want to respond?
Yeah, I want to take a stab at it. So this is more like your first main questions. Going from one state to another state, essentially. Well, right now, okay, so the goal with revolution, right, is one, socialism, and socialism is a transitionary period from capitalism to communism. So on my line of thinking, we have capitalism right now, and then we have a revolution, and then socialism is essentially the dictatorship of the proletariat, which you are sort of right. Right now, under capitalism, the state is essentially the apparatus that one class uses to suppress the other. And right now, under capitalism, the ruling class, the capitalist class, they have control of the state, and they are a minority. So with socialism, with the dictatorship of the proletariat, once the working class were to get hold of the state, we would have hold of the state, which we would have to suppress another class. But now, the people who own this, the people who are in charge of the state, who are running the state, is the majority. Because kind of like what Leah was talking about, basically like the first action of revolution is to defend the revolution. So we do need a state apparatus to suppress any like counter-revolutionary people, actions, things that want to occur that way. And then because the state is the suppression of one class over another, because we're transitioning economic systems from, capitalists and workers, we're not going to have that anymore and under socialism, because the workers are going to own everything. And eventually, because the minority, which is the capitalists, eventually the two classes disappear, right? We want a classless society. And once we reach classless society, that is when the state withers away. But essentially, there is a period where the state is kind of just taken from the minority and placed into the hands of the majority. And so you're kind of correct in the sense that we are going to have to be maybe suppressive to a group, but it's not the way it is now, where we have all these billionaires, locking everybody up. Everything is in their interest. It's about profit. Now the workers are in control, and it's like a true democracy of the masses of the people.
Can I also say a little bit? Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry. Yeah. I organized this, Jessica, by the way, in the PSL. And we actually wrote a whole book on this. It's called Socialist Reconstruction. And we line out what the first 10 years of socialism. So this is presupposing that the working class took power. So say we seize the means of production or whatever they call it, and we have power now. What would the first 10 years look like? And so I know your question is a big question. And we do talk about that. What does it mean for workers to have control? We can't even wrap our heads around that. I think having like community groups and self-defense groups and all that stuff, what would that look like? And I think I would really recommend that you read it. We can maybe talk afterwards. I can let you know where to get it if you'd like. But it's a really inspirational book that talks about how we can imagine the future to be. And Leo is right, the future, it can't be worse than capitalism. And it will, not only is it not worse than capitalism, but it's so inspiring. It almost makes you cry when you read it, because we will get there one day. And I think that it's worth a read.
Please, feel free to leave the literature out. I put some platypus literature over there, and also a sign-up sheet is going around. I wanted to make sure everybody was able to sign in. Did that get passed around to everybody? Yeah, if somebody can locate the sign-up sheet and pass it around, that'd be great. Okay, maybe we can, Addie, how you doing on time?
I'm going to leave in 5 minutes.
Okay, do we have enough? You want to go ahead? And then maybe next we can grab a question from the Zoom next, okay?
Okay. So just a little bit of my background. My background's in environmental science, environmental engineering, and right now I'm in robotics. And so I've always had this sort of deep ecological framework where these sort of what this quaintness about the follies of man, how we consider all these things about our society from a very anthropocentric perspective, ignoring the impacts on all of these other non-human living beings. So the way I've been interpreting all of what you guys were saying is through this sort of this, which is kind of out of fashion now, this Malthusian lens, where we have potential resource constraints. And a way to solve these, or a way to reason about these Malthusian dilemmas, is to look at it as, in this game theoretic sense, of cooperation problems. So considering what each individual is incentivized to do, and whether or not each individual acting rationally to their own self-interest, does everyone arrive at an equilibrium that results in the best outcome for everyone? The prisoner's dilemma is a classic example of where the individual acting rationally results in a suboptimal outcome for everyone. So I guess for each one of you, I have questions which are related to that. So for Jessica, it's like this idea of more like the worker is like the owner of the production wants to reduce wages, but the worker wants to increase wages. We can think of the two income trap as a cooperation problem, where at some point in the past, a family could be supported by the income of one person. As families wanted to elevate their quality of life, both parents entered into the workforce. And now, not saying that this led to it, but because of the cost of living increasing across the board, now you need two parents working to maintain that same lifestyle relative to when things were cheaper. And so I'd be curious to see what your thoughts are in regard to more income being more better, I guess, so it's simplification. To Addie, the question would be, let's see. Yeah, so how you're mentioning how wealth is concentrated, how there's been this disconnect between GDP and productivity. How much of that do you think is due to just our population multiplying by a factor of what, 6 in like a century? So how much of it is just due to more people competing for this finite set of employment opportunities, and thus willing to work for less because they want to be employed? For Leo, the question would be in regard to, as from this democratic lens, why does it seem like most resilient socialist states are not democratic, so kind of operate by dictate? And then the question for Mark would be, yeah, also related to the whole situation with graduate students. I've heard a reason why wages for teachers, graduate students, artists is so low is because they're things that everyone wants to do, and thus they'd be willing to work for less because that's the individual incentive, to work for less to do something that they want to do, even if there are some people who hold out wanting to be compensated accordingly. There are plenty of people who are okay with their level of compensation because they're doing what. So thanks for letting me go on a bit. Hopefully you guys all got that.
First.
No, good.
Oh, you have to leave, actually.
Oh, yeah. No, sure, I was just saying my piece. Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting idea. I'm not sure, we've hit like a Malthusian limit to economic growth. In fact, if you look at like per capita GDP, like per person, the amount of like goods and services we produce, like since the Industrial Revolution, it's just been like an exponential increase.
And the expense of our ecosystems.
Oh yeah, sure. I guess I was just trying to point out that, despite the fact that we're producing more and more goods and services, like the distribution of that wealth, right, and how concentrated it is it varies in periods from being relatively broadly distributed to periods when it's extremely concentrated. I think it's an interesting question.
I hope I'm understanding your question correctly. So basically answering to. Okay, so, two incomes, more income, increase in prices. Yeah. Okay, so, well, I mean, right now, so the standard of living, everything that costs money, you know, the people who own those things, whether they're the homes, the products on the shelves, the food, the people who control the prices are always, they're part of this capitalist ruling class. So yes, because I do support like reforms in this meantime, as you know, we're waiting for revolution to happen. I do think more wages so that, you know, workers can have at least a decent standard of living is a good thing, but ultimately, you know, that's not my goal. I'm not like, yes, just pay everyone more and that's going to fix all the problems, because you're right, that's not going to fix all the problems. The problems won't be fixed until the production and the distribution and all of this is in the hands of the workers and not in the hands of these people who are going to be raising all the prices for everything just to increase their profits. So I hope that kind of answered it.
Yeah, so as to the question as far as why are socialist countries not run democratically? And I think the answer is in large part because those countries came to power using the Marxist-Leninist method, which is to take over a state in the name of your ideology, and then to put state planners in that, or to put planners in that state that are, you know, on board with that. And those countries were not taken to socialism via democratic means, so it would be surprising if they were to implement them after the fact. When you can think about it, right, socialists love to say like, oh, our ideas are so broad, so much appeal, but the truth is that it's a fringe faction of, especially, I mean, you can even say here in the United States, right, like we love to talk about how broad our demands are, but Joe Biden beat Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary just within Democrats by a wide margin. And so to me, that shows that both our ideas and our policies are actually not well supported by a large faction of the country. And so you can imagine, I mean, if Bernie Sanders like had a bunch of guns and said, I'm going to do it anyway, right? It's not, there's no point at which, or it would take a long time for the United, and let's say he won, right? He takes power. It would take a long time for him to be able to say, I'm going to put these guns away and you guys are all going to keep voting for me, right? So it's difficult when you come to power in a non-democratic method to maintain power whilst converting to democracy. It's not that I think that these leaders are against democracy. In fact, I think that they're ardently pro-democracy, but that there's an actual structural problem that's preventing them to shift to like an electoral democracy, at least I'll say, the sort of democracy that we claim to have here. And then I also wanted to just very briefly touch on your question to Mark about why, because grad students maybe get paid less because we do like more fun work or something, work that we enjoy doing and we really want to do it. I don't really think that's how wages are set in relation to how much value we produce or how much fun we have doing it, what our incentive structures are. I would imagine that like probably one of the most enjoyable jobs in terms of just like how much you get to dick around and not have to work is CEO, right? Like these executive positions where, yeah, you might be stressed all the time in some white collar sense, but you never work a muscle. You never have to actually like think and do a math problem. You're not producing real value, but those people get paid a lot. Why? Because they have power. So the low pay that graduate students have is not indicative of like the incentive, because there are places where graduate students get paid lots and lots of money. It's indicative of the fact that we have low power, and that's why we're organizing to fix that.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent way to address part of what I would say. The only other thing I would say is that the trade-off between people willing to work for certain, the idea that there's some pool of people willing to work for a certain wage and for certain awful conditions is not like unique to this particular labor context. Like this has always been true, that in many jobs anywhere over time, there's always been some number of people, perhaps some critical number of people even, that were ready to step in and do the work for slightly less, or for whatever, under whatever conditions were already there. If anything, I would say we have we have a much more advantageous platform than, say, folks that work in, I'm watching comrades working in Starbucks unionization. That's a tough thing to crack. These are jobs that, yeah, there's a lot of people out there that would take them, that would work for those conditions. And to that extent, and there's a low barrier to entry, right? Lots of us here probably worked in food service before. Like, these are things you can be trained to do relatively quickly. The reality is that a lot of the work that we do, you cannot be trained to do relatively quickly. It takes a long time to get trained in order to do what we do. So in that sense, we have even more leverage than many do. But the problem of having people willing to do something for less is not unique to this space. The only other thing I would add to what Leo said is I also don't think it's quite fair to characterize this as like an open. This is not an open market of people coming to sell their labor to the university. What actually happens is people come here, often young people who don't have experience in the workforce, often people who didn't know what else to do, or often people who came under the illusion that there might be career opportunities available to them that simply are not available to them. This maybe wasn't as big of a concern 40 years ago when, you could be guaranteed that after some garbage period in grad school, there's some faculty job somewhere. That's not true anymore. But the illusion is present for many people. And I think there's a lot of people who are fooled into thinking that those opportunities are available. And people are not strictly and correctly evaluating. They're not making a well-informed decision about the nature of what they're entering into in many cases. And once you're in, the sunk costs, start to really take over. If you've put in 3-4 years of your life into this kind of work, and you don't want to walk away from it, or you don't want to go against your boss because you might just be fired and all of that will have gone to waste. That doesn't mean that you're not exploited. And that doesn't mean you like what you're doing. That means you are afraid of the consequences of walking away because you have sunk so much into what you're doing. So it's not strictly true, I don't think, that it's simply, there's like, that it's solely just a function of folks being willing and able to do all of these things along the way.
Okay, could we feel the question? Is there a question there on Zoom?
Yeah.
You got it?
Yeah.
If you don't mind reading that, thank you.
Can I actually just respond to something?
Yeah, sure.
That had just gone and had been said. So I think in talking about like socialist state, we need to really define what democracy is when we're having this conversation, because governments in socialist countries, they don't really take power undemocratically. Like, we can't define democracy as just getting the ability to have like a vote on something. For example, in this country, 80% of people are not happy with Congress. That's 80% of the country is not happy. Is that democratic? I think most people in the room would agree that that's not really that democratic. So to quote a comrade is the real measure of democracy is the ability of a system to recognize the aspirations of its people and what the people want. So meaning if everyone is unhappy with the government they live in and angry enough to want to overthrow that oppressive state apparatus, is that not a democratic means of achieving that? So just an example is Cuba was one of those states that, they didn't vote in a revolution, they had one, but you look at them today, they had 98% turnout in the creation of the new constitution. We have what at most 50% participation in voting. That doesn't sound like democracy. So I think, I think we have to change the conversation on that. But so we have 2 questions. These were throughout the speeches. So they're both from Anthony. So listening to the last speaker, I wonder if the issue is that graduate students have increasingly not become students, but labor. Is this desirable in terms of left politics? Historically, there are other forms of students participating in the left and as laborers. For example, in the new left, issues were anti-war in the US or the conservatism of social democracy and the communist parties. Do we want to read the second?
Yeah, just read the second one as well,
Okay.
please.
The second to last speaker raises the issue of the labor movement and the state. But the way he and other panelists talk about it, it appears not as politics, but as pressure on politics. So the welfare state appears to be the byproduct of the labor movement. But what about the politics of socialism? Is socialism simply the outgrowth of the workers' movement? But the Democratic Party has been tied to organized labor since FDR. The Chartists had political demands, not simply demands labor demands. What should the politics of work be for socialists, and how would it be different from what has been dominant in the 20th century, namely progressivism?
Good, thank you. That may have been aimed at Eddie, but Eddie mentioned the welfare state, but would anyone else care to respond? Either one of those?
Could you repeat the first question again?
Yeah.
There's something in there. to respond to. Or do you have it here? Where is it? You're one of the issues graduate students have increasingly now become students of labor. Yeah, I like this question a lot about graduate students and whether or not they are labor. I think anyone here who's suffered through listening to my speech at some point or another, probably everyone in here individually at some point, has heard me rail about how little student there is in being a graduate student in a university. I have become, I guess, a bit of a hardliner on this. Like, my view is that being a student is when you sit in a lecture and take tests. And that is what a student is. And anything that is not that is not to say that you're not learning outside. We are all learning every day, all the time. That's like a normal part of living. But that is not, those other things are not being a student. Working, I work in a laboratory. When I work in a laboratory, I consider that to be work, and perhaps the best traditional model of what that is being an apprentice. Lots of fields, lots of trades, lots of everything throughout time has had the concept of being an apprentice, where you're still learning how to do something, but it's not being a student in the same sense. And I feel very strongly that this is maybe in part because this is a cudgel that the university keeps hitting us with over and over again. That being a student, a graduate student, at least in a modern American university, is primarily an exercise in being a laborer for a number of years, and a worker for a number of years, and just a very small component of which is being a student.
Yes, so would anyone else want to respond to that one, or this problem of progressive politics feeding into the welfare state ever since Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1930s New Deal? Okay.
So yeah, I'm actually like a big proponent of skepticism about welfare programs, not because I'm anti-welfare or because I want to means test them or anything, but because I think you spoke to this a little bit about how welfare and other social democracy reforms can be kind of chipped away at over time and are not like a permanent fix to anything. And so I think that one of the focuses of socialism in the economic sphere, but also in the pre-revolutionary period, I guess, should be chipping away at the control of owners over the capitalist structures that they own. And so you see some of that in the form of like workers' co-ops, legislation, we do so much. But I think that there's really no solution to it outside of a militant union membership throughout the country. And the reason why is because the union, like being full of workers that are presently in the place where the things are being produced, has like a form of physical control over the means of production that the owners can't maintain because they're physically distal, right? They're not proximal to the actual thing. And then the sort of second half of that coin would be creating like forms of employment that are not themselves tied to an owner or the state, right? Obviously people are employed by the state, but I'm talking about things like worker cooperatives, making so-called freelancing easier for people. That's something that a lot of legislation that we don't talk about so much because it's not such an interesting topic for most people. There's a lot of legislation that's been supported by large corporations to make freelancing more difficult because they want to employ people, right? They don't want to have their employers go and be their own boss. I'm certainly not saying that like if you are freelancing, you live away from the chokehold of capital and that now you live in your own little personal individual communist utopia. But I do think that these forms of models of employment are one way to loosen the strengths that or the control that the capitalists have presently on capital. And I think you see one expression of that is how shitty and awful the gig economy has become. I think the gig economy has sort of become like capitalists' answer to this self-employment thing. It's like, well, what if we made a version of that where you still work for us? And that's also why you see, I think, leftists are more, and actually I would say the working class more generally are more skeptical of gig economies than of the normal. I mean, you hear this rhetoric about, yeah, I just want like a nice paying job at a firm that will take me for 30 years, maybe with union membership, maybe I'm just coding, so I don't need it because I'm white collar enough and I'm producing enough, profit, surplus labor. But yeah, that would be my answer to that is like, how should progressivism be different from who did you mention? FDR should be tied to organized labor. Yeah, we need like militant labor unions, not the kind that like FDR.
I would just, so as a big New Dealer, like I'm a big New Dealer myself. Yeah, I would just push back slightly on the notion that there was no, that the politics of the New Deal were like, and maybe this is not a charitable read of that they were independent of labor. If anything, I would argue it was quite the opposite. The politics of the New Deal were entirely because labor had the biggest stranglehold it has ever had on the American economy. And I think the fruits of that over the subsequent 20, 30 years after that are very obvious. Like it was the most, it was one of the most egalitarian periods in American history. It's an era of better, brighter tomorrow. There's a lot of good stuff to be said for if you allow labor to just become all powerful within the Democratic Party. I think it actually turns out quite a bit better than when you have it on the outside as like something more of today. I would say it's almost akin more to a special interest group. I forget who I was talking to the other day, but it was, there was a time in labor history where, big union leaders, big labor leaders, like you could absolutely expect would be able to call the White House and the White House would answer. I don't think there's any labor leader anywhere in the country who could even get through to an undersecretary now. It's just not something that happens anymore because labor has been to some extent relegated to special interest pressure group status now, rather than before where it was simply driving what the politics of the day were.
Did you care to respond, Jessica, or no? Okay, so let's open it back up to maybe Carlo, since you haven't gone yet.
Sure.
Oh, and did the sign up sheet go around? You can just, it did? Okay, awesome. Cool.
So this is one thing anybody's welcome to respond to because everybody's kind of brought it up to some degree and was sort of evident really well in the presentation where multiple graphs kind of showed that even in spite of some correlation, the wealth disparity has been getting significantly worse ever since the inception of capitalism. And that coupled with destruction of the environment, but even on its own really does mean that capitalism, I would argue, is headed toward a crisis at some point, regardless of what happens under the status quo. Not that changing the status quo is necessarily a bad thing. I do think that improving the lives of people right now is a worthwhile endeavor, but it is headed somewhere. So my question to everyone really is, what can we really do right now to prepare, regardless of when it necessarily is, but prepare for the inevitable revolution or whatever is happening? And how do you think that would come about?
You want to take it?
Yeah, I can go first. So to the question of when or how do I think revolution will come about? I think that's, it's difficult to predict, obviously, probably in the form of it's going to be violent, the form of some sort of war, whether it be civil war or something, in America, at least I'm talking about in the US, like in particular. And I think the crisis deepening, what you're talking about is very true. Like we can see it just like with the inflation, just with everything. The US really trying to hold on to whatever power, global power it has even left, it's really gripping at straws at this point. I think we're in a very critical time. And as for preparing, I think that's where all this talk of, solidarity, political education, coalition, that's all really important at this time. And also because what is the alternative of, capitalism in crisis? What is the alternative? Where it's either going to be like communism, socialism, or fascism. And I think it's really important for like creating people's defense groups, whether it's defense militias or anything, people learning to like fight survival tactics, things like that, developing skills that can be useful. And then also just sharing kind of the knowledge that you have, what figuring out, where other people's struggles are, where they're at in this, political development.
Join a party.
Yeah, joining a party,
Yeah.
but
No, that's what I was gonna say is in terms of preparation, join PSL, join DSA, like come hang out with us. We're talking about it all the time. But more seriously, so I do think that one of the biggest, I said this earlier, the biggest impediment right now to a revolution whereby we like replace or abolish the state, either one. The biggest impediment is like the militarization of the police. Obviously, the military itself doesn't help much. But I'm actually more skeptical about the police because I think it would be like if there was a possibility where a revolution is actually breaking out, I think it might be possible that the military is neutralized, if they choose not to fire on civilians or for some reason the power structures there have been like turned off preemptively. Somebody unplugged all the nukes. I don't know what it would be, but I tend to be skeptical of the idea that the military itself would be the limiting factor. But especially as we enter this like era of neoliberalism where the United States is sort of just sitting on its laurels and like sucking wealth out of the third world and then throwing that wealth into its military. And then of course the military has been selling a lot of like their expired tear gas. They'll just sell to the police or whatever. And that's why the police is as militarized as they are. And so, yeah, I think that were violent revolution to break out anytime soon, it would go really poorly for us and probably would result in fascism. So it probably will be a while, or like at least let's hope. And then when the time does come, we're going to need the state to be brittle, right? We're going to need to wait for the state to sort of be brittle. And I think the incoming climate catastrophe is going to be a big part of that in terms of causing geopolitical uncertainty in all sorts of areas, especially those areas that we rely on for the extraction of profit. And as that kind of comes to a screeching halt, there will be a sect of the political elites who want a restructuring along the sort of fascist lines, maybe reverting to like a pre-capitalist power structure or just having a straight dictatorship. And then the other sort of force at the same time, also, this is also caused by the climate crisis. So I'm sorry, force A, to be clear, is the shutting down of factories and other productive zones in third world countries that we meaning the United States and the West more generally, are currently extracting super profits from. And then the second thing is going to be those same areas and other areas that are hit hard by climate change and don't have like vast liberal states that have been, extracting profit from others so that they can protect themselves. They're going to experience severe migration, right? We're going to have climate refugees, and my view is that will probably dominate world politics by about 2050 is the climate refugee question. When you've got millions of people crossing borders, the legitimacy of those government structures that are supposed to supposedly are enforcing the borders starts to crumble. And so when, yeah, I mean, it's really hard to predict how it would play out exactly, but in terms of preparation, you know, I'll reiterate, join a socialist organization, a revolutionary socialist organization. I have gone. Those are my two.
Can I
Please.
give an alternate vision? Yeah, so I am decidedly a non-accelerationist, and I am decidedly about improving the material conditions of people in the world. This is why I do labor organizing. This is why I do what I do. I think people should also grapple very seriously, you know, whether or not you're interested in crisis moments that allow for revolution or not, the possibility that these moments do not come or do not materialize. And you should organize yourselves accordingly to figure out ways that you are still improving people's lives. I ultimately believe that is the goal of all of this, you know, worker empowerment. The goal of worker empowerment is not violent revolution. It is to empower workers and to empower people. That is the end goal. To that extent, I think some of our colleagues have already brought up this point earlier, which I think is an excellent point, which is that trust in left politics and in left organizations and in any kind of socialist organizations is, I think it's safe to say, at very low levels. Even a very mainstream, in my view, guy like Bernie Sanders was not able to pull off a win. I think Bernie's great. Love Bernie. He's got great politics. Really like him. Good guy. Was still not able to pull off a win. I think that one of my favorite things about what DSA as an organization has done in the past 5, 6, 7 years is that they have taken on the spirit of, you know, sort of the sewer socialists from the early 20th century. Folks whose idea was that municipal governments and cities and local politics and housing and transit and all of the regular, boring, mundane things that make people's lives good need to be well managed. People need to trust the socialists in order to empower them with anything. And I'm a big fan of DSA getting heavily involved in city council elections. Things that I think even the most radical among us would not say are probably, the folks who are running city councils are probably not going to be at the forefront of you know, revolution anywhere anytime soon. But these are important things that matter to people's lives. And to the specific question I think that you brought up earlier is like, what do you do in the meantime? Do the most, you know, productive, you know, most progressive, most left-leaning thing you can viably do that will help to materially improve people's lives. And I think that's a big takeaway that no one should lose any sight of, because it is always possible that none of the crises that might be used as inflection points for whatever, they just don't materialize. You know, we've had a history of technology solving seemingly intractable problems. You know, we've talked a lot about agrarian societies today. It is simply factually true that farm labor and economic labor is around 100 times, around 2 orders of magnitude more productive than it was 200 years ago. You just don't need as many people working a field to do stuff. These are like real disruptions that can happen. And like, if you're relying on climate crisis to bring around like a more left-leaning state, you know, capitalism is clever. It has survived for quite a long time because it's good at solving all kinds of problems. I think even Marx and Engels themselves would admit that it was good at solving certain problems. And the end result is that you spend time not solving problems that are in front of you. This, of course, is colored by like what I do, labor organizer. I'm worried about workers today, right now, not not necessarily 50 years from now. But I think it's something that is a useful thing for all of us in here to always at least, you know, consider as a possibility.
Okay, so we are pretty much at the end. Let's maybe take another round of questions, and if you could fold closing remarks into the questions. So maybe we can take a stat. Are there any remaining questions? Please.
So I just wanted to touch on something that was mentioned over here with Cuba and see if our panelists wanted to make a response to that, because I found that point interesting that was being made, and I was just wondering if somebody wanted to weigh in on it.
Can you repeat the point? I don't recall.
So that, I think it was in response to you, Leo, about socialist or communist governments not being democratic. and then-
No, sure, I'd love to speak to this. Yeah,
the-
you're talking about phrases.
like that Cuba has elections with 80% turnout, although they only have one party to vote for. So I was just wondering if you guys have anything to.
Yeah,
weigh in on that.
Wait, hold off on the response. Any other questions?
Okay.
And then we'll go around, we'll take them all, and then you can respond to whatever you want to, okay? Alex, do you want to go?
So we talk a lot about like, oh, it can't get worse, it can't get worse than here, right? The annual question of the barbarism. At what point do you think the material conditions in the US can, will we see like more, I mean, we're seeing it now, I mean, we're seeing like armed like right-wing groups outside of outside of LGBT clubs and stuff. At what point, like, will material conditions get worse enough that we'll see like more and more encouragement of fascist rhetoric, especially if the Democratic Party doesn't necessarily do anything to curb it, and outright encouragement from like more right-wing parties in the US.
Okay, was there another one back here? Please.
Yeah, what is the difference of the context of like the knowledge economy versus the like Fordist manufacturing economy? That could prevent what happened historically in the offshoring of labor across the globe and the kind of fracturing of social bonds and like nodes of control that could be organized.
Okay, thank you. Were there any other questions?
Yeah, this one's from Zoom.
Okay.
Same person. I'm interested in the idea of graduate work as apprenticeship, so just labor. But doesn't this concede to the trends in the university toward gutting the educational content to increase their competitiveness? How would the university escape these pressures if it were worker run?
Good. Any final questions? Please.
Yeah, I just wanted to give a quick comment actually on Cuba. You actually don't have to be a part of the party to be nominated into a position in Cuba. People are like teachers, organizers in the community. I think the party is a workers' party. In that sense, you can think about it similar to the union, where the union says we are the union is us. Similar in Cuba, the party is the people, it's a workers' party. But actually, I wanted to say that I thought what Mark said was actually really important, that the role of a revolutionary party isn't necessarily that we're gonna like take arms and do revolution, right? We're not accelerationist either. I think it's important that as a party, we be able to be involved in the workers' struggle so that we may be able to lead the people with a popular political program that people can stand behind, because there will always, capitalism, you're right, is incredibly intelligent and adaptive. And it always has their ground workers ready to take the workers' new consciousness into different avenues that are not revolutionary. And so our role as revolutionaries really is to popularize socialism. And when the millions of us are signed on to this revolutionary program, even if the state is incredibly militarized, we can overcome it. We saw during the protests in George Floyd that, there was like hundreds of thousands of people that came out, and and a group of those people overturned like cop cars and set them on fire, right? There is no stopping the millions of us. And that is the role of a revolutionary party, which is really to speak to the masses in a way that they understand and is popular, and that we can make revolutions. So I'm so sorry, that's not really a question, but if you want to talk about it, that'd be great.
Okay, excellent. So with that, could you please give us closing remarks and respond to any of the questions that you like?
Yeah, I actually want to take two at the same time. I want to talk about Ashwin's and I want to talk about this other one also. I think I have depressing answers for both. So good way to send us off. On the question of offshoring knowledge labor versus factory labor, I actually think it's much easier to offshore knowledge labor than it is factory labor, simply for technological reasons. And I think we already see some of this pressure in the fact that we see just like there are way more people pursuing graduate education, which is not a bad thing. I want to be really clear, that's not bad. But it is also true that the number of, say, academic positions to fill in has not meaningfully, or certainly not kept pace with that increase in the number of people who are in it. So we already have seen some version of this internally. I see no reason that that can't continue externally as people across the world, simply find it easier to obtain higher education in different ways. To the other question, graduate work as apprenticeship doesn't concede to the trends in the university towards gutting the educational content to increase competitiveness. I have bad news about what universities are. Universities are collections of prestige, and these institutions exist to perpetuate themselves and perpetuate what's in the privileges and the prestige of the people in them. As a side benefit, they are slightly more productive and more useful for society than, say, I don't know, like Facebook probably. Like they do produce something that I think has some intrinsic value beyond, that is stated. But I do think as universities exist, that they already are gutting educational content in the name of degree manufacturing. I already see them primarily as credentialing institutions, and I already have a very dim view of how they operate. That's not to say I don't want to work in one of them. Being faculty seems like a pretty sweet job. You get paid a lot to, being tenure faculty seems like it's really fun. So after I'm done pissing off everybody in the UC system, we'll see if any of them want to hire me anymore afterwards.
Well, yeah. So first, as regards like the curbing of ongoing fascism, I think that this is in part a response to, like, from the perspective of the fascists who've sort of been written off, right? Like you see mostly it's white men who are the shooters, right? And you see often they have these manifestos about like infiltration or like the replacement theory, things to this effect. So it's a hard question, right? Like I don't think it's purely, they're not rational political actors. So it's hard to engage with that, like you can't debate somebody out of shooting up a mall. And so one of the potential responses, and this is the response favored by Democratic Party elites, is so let's just beef up security, right? Like if there are going to be lots of fascists, let's have more cops, more cameras, more guns. And I don't have like a positive response to there's some things we can do, obviously, right? We can have like community self-defense organizations and so forth, but it's very difficult at present to deal with this problem in a productive way for socialist politics. I know some of the people who organize San Diego Pride, and like they're pretty liberal folks, but they're always getting a lot of pressure to like from queer groups to get cops out of Pride, right? Because this is a whole thing. And their response every year like wins the argument, which is that if there are no cops there, they're just going to blow us away. Like they're fascists shooting up gun or doing gun shootings. There's not any other kind of shooting to like drag shows and so forth every week in this country now. So it's really difficult to see an out there. And then so as far as Cuba goes, so and like democracy and socialist countries more generally. So yeah, Cuba definitely is a lot more democratic. Like I certainly don't want to write them off. When the question was asked, and it had focused on China, which is what I was thinking of more, and also phrased democracy. I mean, I think the question was mostly about electoralism. So for a lot of people, democracy and electoralism are the same terms. I sort of replied in kind using those, but I don't mean to say that like, because they don't have a representative assembly, they're necessarily anti-democratic. I do think that when you take power with a violent revolution, it becomes really difficult to transition into a republic. And that's not me saying, therefore, all violent revolutions are wrong, right? Like, I kind of wish Bernie had more guns, you know, but at the same time, if he did, it would be really difficult 4 years later for him to be like, now you guys vote for me for real. And that's not like, that is just a tactical problem. It's not a moralist, like, oh, you have to do it the right way so that the people like you. It's just, there are trade-offs to coming to power in different means. And I think one of the trade-offs when you like violently excise capitalists from your country, pro, no more capitalists, con, people are skeptical of you. In the Cuban National Assembly, so like all of the people, there's only one position. Like when a person runs for the National Assembly, there's typically only one candidate. And that candidate is nominated by the Communist Party, though not a member, and or doesn't have to be a member. And then that body, the National Assembly, votes for its president, prime minister, president, forget, whatever the CEO of Cuba is called. But so it's difficult. I mean, to me, that like there is an electoral system there. I don't know how democratic it is. I certainly think they get much better results than we do, right? Like they are leading the country or leading the world in terms of countries helping with like COVID and other kind of medical emergencies. I like Cuba, I'm pro-Cuba, favorite Marxist Leninist organization or government. But I think that there's a real question as to how democratic they are. And I'm also somebody who doesn't think that democracy is a moral good. To wrap up my remarks, I would say that, yeah, if you guys enjoyed this panel, come to the platypus readings, and then also join DSA or PSL if we're too lit for you, and also join a union if you're eligible. Thanks.
Hey, Jessica.
Okay, I kind of just wanted to address kind of what Alex asked and also some comments by Mark. You know, to the point, you know, people have been saying, you know, it can't get worse, but I agree kind of with you, it can, and we see that happening. Just with the economic crisis, rolling back of reproductive rights, the US kind of escalating conflicts with Russia and China. And I just learned today, there's literally like a right-wing militia group in Atwater. Like these things are happening here and now. But to the point of, you know, maybe crises don't materialize, I don't think that's really the issue. Crises, they do materialize. We see them happening now. But like Nancy mentioned, if we're not taking advantage of this, if the people aren't prepared for it, then obviously no change is going to happen. So I think that's why with a party and with educating people, raising people's political consciousness, that's important. It's like getting people aware of this. You know, you guys are all coming here and hearing about these things and learning about these things, having these discussions with people, so that when these crises do arise, we're not caught like, oh, we're not caught slacking. Like you have to take advantage to make and create change if you want to see change. And yeah, and you know, we hope that the change is obviously for socialism. And I think that the beauty of the future is that we don't really know what it's going to look like, but we're all going to create it together. And like Nancy mentioned, we do have a book that kind of maybe paints a picture. If you guys were interested, maybe not the picture, you know, we never know for sure, but some sort of picture. And so I think the goal is just to get more people, you know, on board and thinking about that and thinking about what they want to see in society and what empowering workers really means and looks like.